All right, thanks.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the December installment of our VSA webinar series, which comes to you from the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and addresses topics related to the arts and special education. I'm Jenna Gabriel, the Manager of Special Education here at the Center, and I will be leading today's webinar, Arts is Inclusion, Holding Ourselves Accountable in Reaching Students with Disabilities. My colleague, Megan Bailey, will be assisting me with moderating today's webinar, particularly during our question and answer time at the end. If you would like to view live stream captioning of this webinar, you can follow the link you see on this slide and in the chat box of the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Before we get started, let's touch base on the GoToWebinar control panel. This control panel can be hidden by clicking on the orange arrow in the top left corner. If you need to leave the webinar early, you can do so by clicking on the X in the upper right-hand corner. A recording of the webinar will be available afterwards, so you can catch up on any parts you missed. You can connect the audio portion of the webinar through your telephone or through your computer's microphone and speakers. Select the option that works best for you. But if you are calling in from your telephone, please make sure you mute your computer speakers. You can submit comments, questions, or answers to questions using the chat panel located near the bottom of the control panel. Megan will be monitoring it throughout the webinar. If you prefer to speak your input rather than typing it, please click on the raise your hand icon on the control panel, and I will touch base with you and unmute your microphone at the appropriate time. At the end of today's presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions about the material. During this open-ended question and answer time, please click on the raise your hand icon if you wish to speak, or type your thoughts into the chat panel. Within the week, we'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's presentation, a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and a copy of the webinar transcript. This means you can go back to watch the recording and review supplemental materials in addition to any notes you take during the webinar itself. Our January webinar, The Design and Use of Inclusive Surveys and Arts Programs, will be led by members of the Kennedy Center Research and Evaluation Team and will take place on January 10th at 3 p.m. The registration link can be found in your chat panel. If you're active on social media, I invite you to connect with us using hashtag VSAWebinar. On Facebook, we are VSA International. And on Twitter, we are VSAINTL, and we would love to engage with you. And with that, I'll begin today's presentation, Art as Inclusion, Holding Ourselves Accountable in Reaching Students with Disabilities. As we know, in efforts to provide many opportunities as possible for students with disabilities to learn alongside their typically developing peers, there are an increasing number of students with diverse learning needs in inclusive settings. Very often these settings are non-academic classrooms. As art teachers, we see these kids in our classrooms frequently and are tasked with addressing their learning needs within the context of the materials we're teaching. And it's the central assumptions and values of the arts classroom that make it this welcoming place for students with disabilities. So in this webinar, I really want to push us to push that notion forward, challenging us to question those assumptions and really hold ourselves accountable to the promise of inclusive instruction, that our students with disabilities engage with art content and make meaning alongside their peers. So I want to start by providing some special education context. The Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, was passed in 1975, and as we know, this is the federal law that ensures access to quality education for students with disabilities. So there are 6 core tenets or premises of IDEA, and I want to just do a quick overview of those. The first is the Individualized Education Program, or the IEP. This is required for public schools to create for each student who's eligible for special education services under IDEA. And it's really the cornerstone of a student's education program. It's designed with an IEP team that has to include the parents, very often the students, a special ed teacher, a regular education teacher, someone who interprets educational assessments, as well as an administrator or related service providers. And these folks are all really working together to make sure that the students' needs are met in classrooms. The second is the notion of a free, appropriate public education. So IDEA guarantees that all students who are eligible to receive special education services do so at the public's expense, just as they would if they were in a typically developing child in a public school. Third is the notion of least restrictive environment. This mandates that students with disabilities, to the maximum extent possible, be educated alongside their typically developing peers. Right? So when we talk about inclusion, very often we're talking about this section of the law. The fourth has to do with appropriate evaluation, and unlike summative assessment, this really has to do with how a child is designated as eligible for special education services, and it's an attempt to mediate some misdiagnosis and make sure that students are assessed fairly for whether or not they need special education services. The fifth really celebrates the relationship between parents and teachers in ensuring a high-quality education for a student with a disability, and it makes sure that parents are viewed as really valuable members of a child's education team. And finally, IDEA puts in place procedural safeguards that protect the rights of children and their families. This could include everything from access to educational records, understandable language of school materials, and due process for if a parent has a dispute with the school. As we're dealing with questions of inclusion today, the one that we're really tuned into right now on this webinar is this notion of the least restrictive environment. So I'm going to read really quickly, actually directly from the law. Right, so to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or care facilities, are educated with children who are non-disabled. And special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from regular education environments occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplemental aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Right, so this means that inclusion is the goal. And when I talk about that, and especially when I think of it as working in concert with those other 5 tenets of the law, this means more than just putting a kid in the classroom, right? And that's where the onus is really on us as educators to adapt our instruction and to make sure that a child with a disability who is included in one of our classrooms really is accessing the same content as their peers in meaningful ways and ways that are relevant to them. So let's check in with where we're at with the least restrictive environment. So as of 2012, which is the most recent federal data that we have, nearly 95% of students with disabilities are educated in regular school, so not a residential facility or a separate schooling environment. And most of those students are spending more than 80% of their school time in classes with their typically developing peers. Students who spend less than 40% of the school day alongside their peers is right about 14%. It's a little bit less. Now, when I look at this data, this is across disability categories. So I actually want to encourage us to go one more level down. For our students that are the hardest to serve, that require the most support, our students with multiple disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and autism, that percentage of students who are spending less than 40% of the school day alongside their peers is significantly higher than 14%. We're looking at 46, 49, and 33, respectively. The other thing that this data doesn't address that is something I want us to be thinking about in this webinar is this doesn't tell us where these kids are spending their time. Now we can look to anecdotal data and we can look to historical precedent to know that these kids are in the art class. Because in 1975, when this law was passed and we started what was then called mainstreaming, when we started putting kids with disabilities alongside their typically developing peers, art classes were among the first settings for students with disabilities to be included. Right, so let's unpack for a little bit why, right? Why are the arts such a welcoming place for students? I've pulled some common assumptions, some things from my own experience that either other teachers or administrators have told me, things that were once assumptions in my own practice, and we'll unpack these kind of as we go. Teaching art is easier than teaching math. Now we all know that that's grossly undersells the rigorous instruction and work that we as arts educators do, but it can be this kind of common assumption about why an art teacher would be better prepared to serve a kid with a disability. There's no wrong answer in art, so everyone can succeed. It's a fun subject, so expectations of students with disabilities can be lower. Students with disabilities have an opportunity to socialize with their peers in the art classroom. And finally, the arts are inherently differentiated, so everyone can access the curriculum. Now, this is by no means an exhausted list of assumptions around arts instruction, but what frustrates me about a lot of these many of these misconceptions is that it diminishes, right, the rigor of the work that we do. And we want to hold our students and ourselves accountable to high expectations in accessing art curriculum. We want to ensure that students with disability can access the content in a way that isn't just socializing with peers, but really meaningfully participating. And we know that the research is on our side. Right, we know that research supports the benefits of arts instruction for students with disabilities. So again, this is by far from an exhaustive list of the literature that's out there, but even just in our last webinar series, we know that drama activities and teaching strategies are linked to gains in theory of mind and emotion recognition, things that are intricately tied to learning readiness in an academic classroom. We know that drama-based pedagogies are linked to improvement in language and literacy, that arts instruction has been tied to improvements in communication, in social skills, and in academics, and that the visual arts specifically are linked to increased positive behaviors and academic skills like sequencing or understanding of concrete concepts or abstract concepts. So what I really want us to think about and what kind of drives me in my own work is how do we maximize that, right? How do we maximize what we know about arts education for students with disabilities to challenge our assumptions, and I would say to substantiate some of those assumptions about art's inherent benefit. And by doing that, how does that allow us to better reach and engage our students? So the framework that I'd like to talk about today is differentiated instruction. So when we talk about differentiated instruction, we're talking about instruction that is proactively planned, right? So differentiated instruction is an attempt to mitigate those moments of when you look up in your lesson and you realize that one of your students or three of your students or all of your students are not on the same page. And it does this by accounting for student need in the lesson design. So effective differentiation is a design choice that supports individualized instruction that's catered to a diverse student body. Good differentiated instruction is flexible and responsive. It supports students' engagement with core content in different ways by utilizing different styles of grouping and multiple modes of instruction. It's also marked by frequent use of formative assessment, which informs a teacher's understanding of students' engagement and allows for in-the-moment adjustments, right? So it allows you to sort of walk between groups and see how your kids are doing and have that inform the next choice you make. And finally, differentiated instruction should be respectful. Right? It almost goes without saying, but high-quality differentiated instruction relies on high-quality curriculum and on high expectations because it's based on the assumption that all students can access the curriculum when the instruction supports their natural variance in ability, readiness, and interest. So high-quality differentiated instruction is marked by what Carol Tomlinson calls respectful tasks, or assignments that give each student the optimal amount of challenge paired with the optimum amount of scaffolding. So when we talk about differentiating our instruction, we break this down into differentiation through three avenues. We differentiate instruction through content, through process, and for product. I'm going to dive into each of these individually. So when we talk about content, we're talking about the what of our teaching. As you design your lesson, you're asking yourself what knowledge or skills students are going to learn, and that's the content, right? That's what you're committing that every student is going to understand. So let's use an art lesson on community quilts and symbolism as an example, right? So I'm leading this lesson. I want my students to understand the use of symbolism in art. I want them to look at anchor works like Endicott cloth and historic story quilts. And we're going to be doing this through the project of creating a community quilt that's made up of individual panels that students are going to paint that share an important story to them through symbols. Okay, so in the language of standards, right, I'm asking students to create and develop new work, new artistic ideas. I'm asking them to relate those artistic ideas of visual symbolism to the anchor content, to these external ideas of Endicott cloth and historic story quilts, as well as with their own personal meaning and stories. And I'm asking them to understand and evaluate that the arts can convey meaning through symbolism. Right now, naturally, there are other things that my kids are going to learn in this lesson. I'm going to go through the history of story quilts, for example. But my core content, what I'm committing that every student is going to know and be able to do, I want every student to understand symbols as a way of conveying meaning, and I want them to relate that idea to their own lives as they create this panel. So next, we differentiate through process. This is the how of what we teach. So as you're designing your lesson, you're asking yourself how you're going to communicate that core content to your students, and specifically what activities are they going to take part in to build that understanding and mastery. So if we go back to our lesson, I'm going to start by building a shared definition of what a symbol is, right? So I'm going to do this in a couple of ways. I'm going to have a large group conversation with prompting and examples. I might provide an example of a dove as a symbol for peace. And together we'll brainstorm other symbols that communicate messages of peace. I'm going to put that up on the board so my visual learners can see it. And I'm going to encourage students to write down if that's something that's helpful for them for their processing. And then I might break kids into smaller groups. So I might assign a group researching a symbol's origin or identifying visual instances in either magazines or art books where we see some of the symbols that we've named as symbols for peace, right? And so those kids are identifying other instances. When we move into introducing these anchor artworks, I want to show them to kids in as many ways as possible. So I might show a video of artists creating quilts or cloths, and I'd provide a graphic organizer so that students can organize their thoughts. I'd project images onto screens, but also provide accompanying printouts. And I might seek out opportunities where students can meet with artists or where we can go to a local museum and really see and touch the examples of these artworks. So in all of those, I'm thinking about providing multiple ways for students to access that content and multiple modalities for that content to be communicated. So finally, we differentiate our instruction through product. So this is how the students then communicate their understanding back to us. So as you design your lesson, you're thinking of how you're going to know that you've gotten through to students. What projects could you design that would support a student showing you that they've developed the skills and the knowledge that you planned for? Right, so as I said earlier, my final project for this is a community quilt. I want each student to have designed and painted a panel that they can contribute to the project. But remember what my core content is. I want every student to understand symbols as a way to convey meaning, and I want to relate that idea to their own lives as they make this panel, which means that when I think of different ways to demonstrate understanding, I can and should consider different media. If the content isn't learning to paint, if that's not my goal, if the content is learning the symbolism, then I can have students who are going through magazines and who are picking out symbols, who are cutting and making collages. If I have a student whose interest is in needlework or in screen printing, I can support that as their product, right? Because again, they're all having the opportunity to show me that they understand the core content. So the important thing is that the product is tied to the learning goal that you've identified. So we know that we differentiate instruction for the students in the room, but there are three specific things that we break that down to when we're talking about differentiated instruction. So we know we differentiate through content, process, and product. We differentiate for interest, readiness, and the learner's profile. So interest, right, we know that different students have different interests, different preferences, different passions. When we differentiate our instructions, we consider how we can capitalize on these, how we can view passions as strengths, and how we can view these as avenues through which to access instructional materials. We differentiate for readiness, right? Students bring diverse experiences into the classroom, and all of that informs the prior knowledge that they draw upon when they access new material. So in lessons that build on previous material, it can be as simple as knowing which students understood key vocabulary or concepts that are foundations for a new lesson. It could be concrete, like student performance levels, and it can be abstract, like a student's comfort level with new challenges. And finally, we differentiate for a student's learning profile. So every student accesses content differently. We have visual learners, we have students who need to write notes to understand auditory content, students who need active discussion to process. I include in this social and cognitive disabilities as a consideration, right? So how does the neurological development of a student influence his ability to engage with my instruction? And what things do I need to change to help that student access the content that I'm delivering? So when we return to the definition of so when we get this information about our students from a number of different categories, right? We know that we get them from IEPs when we're lucky and from collaboration with our other teachers. And we want to make sure in the best case scenario that art educators are included in the IEP meetings, right? We have a responsibility to advocate for necessary supports that follow students into the art classroom so that they're supported in accessing the curriculum you're delivering. Now we know that that's a best case scenario. That's not something that, that always happens. And so what we rely on then is formative assessment. This is what Carol Tomlinson calls the ongoing exchange between teachers and students to improve learning. And I really think of this as a driver in your classroom, right? So it's great when an IEP can give you information about learning profile. It's great when a special education teacher or resource room teacher can share with you things that a student needs to succeed. But, but, differenti but differentiation thrives on as much information as you can, right? So think about what you know about interest or readiness or learning profile. And as you go through the lesson, you find more out, right? You're doing this formative assessment, you're learning things about student interest, and then that's affecting the decision that you make about content, about process, or about product. So you make that choice and you see how students engage and you see how students respond. That's more formative assessment, and that leads then to another choice about differentiation. So for example, my knowledge of a student's autism could inform the kind of classroom that I design. It could inform how I set the lights, what volume I speak in, how much we're doing in group work, what we're touching. But my assessment then of how that student demonstrates his understanding, how I observe his successes or his challenges in that environment that I've set up, this is what's giving me more information about that student. It's giving me information about his learning profile, perhaps about his interests or his readiness. And that's informing the next choice that I make about my teaching. So if we return to our definition of differentiated instruction, it's a proactive approach that's accounting for learner variability and is marked by flexibility, responsiveness, and respect. So we know that good differentiated instruction meets students where they are, that we're making instructional choices with the students in mind, and that we're seeking additional information constantly through formative assessment. We know that good differentiated instruction provides multiple entry points for core content, that it recognizes that students access material through processes that are multimodal, and it gives students multiple ways to communicate their understanding. And finally, at every possible opportunity that we can, we're making opportunities for interaction and for engagement, both because we know that that's what high-quality instruction looks like, and because we know that that's something that can provide us as educators feedback. So I like to think of the supports in differentiated instruction as having kind of 3 tiers. That sort of triangle might make sense to folks who look at things with a response to intervention sort of a model, right? So we start with differentiated instruction. We start with planning and implementing with differentiation in mind. And in many classrooms, that's enough, right? Making choices about multiple ways of presenting content, multiple ways of students responding back to you, that provides opportunity for every student to interact and to make meaning. When necessary, we adapt our activities, right? And this is an opportunity to meet the particular needs of a student, but we do it within the activity as it was initially designed. This could be as simple as providing a student a grip on a paintbrush, something that allows them to participate in the activity, but that's adapted to a specific need that they have. And finally, and this applies usually to the fewest number of students in a classroom, we modify the activities. And this is where we actually change the activity itself so that we've met a need of the student. When we do this, though, even though it's kind of our last resort, we do it with the core content in mind still, really saying that we want to make sure that whatever activity we end up changing to, it still is designed to meet the learning goal that we've identified for all of our students. So if we look at that in the arts context, I'll take us back to that symbolism lesson. The community quilt lesson accounted for student variance through proactive design, right, through presenting those core anchor art forms and the content about symbolism in ways that were multimodal, that responded to student needs. We can adapt the activity when necessary to support particular students in the quilting project. So remember, I had envisioned it as being a painting activity, with each student painting their panel. Some of my students might need an adaptive grip. Some of my students with sensory needs might need finger paints, or students who have less fine motor skills could use fingerprints. And that allows a student to participate still in the painting process and the activity as it was designed, but it's adapted to a specific need that they have. And finally, when I have students who need the activity actually to be modified, right, who aren't going to be creating a painting. Let's say it's because they're struggling with creating new ideas on their own with generating that content, but I still want them to be thinking about symbolism and thinking about ways to tell their story. I can provide them a selection of symbols to choose from. I can provide them with magazines and with posters and allow them to collage their panel. And they're still participating, right, in that content. So the next question when I think about these things, I think about as a profession, are we ready? Right? And the recent research actually indicates that the majority of arts educators don't yet feel prepared to teach students with disabilities. So I'm looking at a 2015 survey, and of the survey teachers, only 21.8% felt that the university coursework when they were studying to be educators prepared them to teach students with disabilities. 26% felt prepared to promote enriching experiences in their classroom, and that's compared to nearly 95% when asked about students with disabilities. Right? And so we know that there are professional development opportunities out there. I'll plug Intersections on this webinar series. We know that we have people who are doing incredible work. So I think about how we distill this message in a way that educators can be prepared to work with these students. And I think about 4 key takeaways from differentiated instruction. The first is to design for variation, right? Think about the core content, the most important learning goal that you have, and think of multiple ways you can communicate it for students and for them to communicate it back to you. Formative assessment is key. Build in frequent opportunities for it and allow what you find out about your students in those moments to influence the decisions that you make in the classroom. Right? Be flexible with the lesson that you have and work within your learning goals to make sure that every student is accessing meaning. This notion of respectful tasks, of providing students with a level of challenge that's optimal, right, and respectful of their abilities, of their strengths and their interests. I think about how important it is to provide scaffolding that supports students in being challenged, but that also provides exercises that are meaningful wherever they're coming from. And finally, be an advocate, right? So being this kind of early site for inclusion gives you this unique vantage point. When you see students' success in your classroom, think about what structures you had put in place that allowed them to be successful and try to see if other teachers can be doing the same thing. On the flip side of that, make sure that when other teachers have information about the students you see, that they're sharing it with you. So references are here for folks to take a look at. I wanted to keep the webinar as minimal with me talking as possible to allow for a lot of opportunity for questions or for kind of community problem solving. And so I'm going to pass some of this over to Megan to actually start moderating a Q&A. So again, in our question and answer session, you can type your questions into the chat panel or you can raise your hand, and at the appropriate time, Megan will unmute you. So let's go ahead and get started.
Hi everyone, this is Megan. I will be helping Jenna with the questions once we get some in. All right, we got our first question in for Jenna. The question is differentiation the same thing as UDL, or UDL a component of differentiation?
That's a great question. They are technically 2 different things in the sense that they come from UDL really came out of the universal design work, really from architecture, and then was adapted and created into an educational framework by the CAST Institute in Boston. So they are different in the sense that who created them and what where they came from is. They're different frameworks, but you're picking up on a lot of the same language, and they share a lot of the same principles. The idea of thinking of multiple ways to engage students, multiple ways to present content, multiple ways to have students communicate content back to you. A lot of that is language of UDL, but it absolutely plays into the differentiated instruction framework. So it's a strategy that you can use when you think about differentiating your process, and it's also a strategy that you can use when you think about differentiating product or how students communicate understanding back to you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Could you please speak more on how you determine if an activity is a respectful task, especially for the students who are nonverbal?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first question that I ask myself when thinking about respectful tasks is if it aligns to the content, right? So the first and most important way that I think we respect students' autonomy and student skills is by holding them to the same content standard that we hold all of the other students in the classroom, right? So if I have students who are generating symbols and who are creating new work, and then I have a student who's doing a coloring activity where I've drawn the symbol, that student isn't accessing the same content. And so even a student who's nonverbal, if we can support pointing at images or colors, choosing materials that help that student to express the story that they want to share, we're giving them that autonomy and they're participating in the content. And so as I said, the first question that I ask is it aligned to the content that is being taught to all students? And then I think about what skills the student is bringing. How does the student typically communicate meaning or take part in activities? Is it as simple, so this question is what supports does the student need to be able to access the content? Is it as simple as providing a grip? Is it as simple as programming other pictures or other options into their communication board? And I try to build in those supports. So it's a fine line and kind of a dance between those two things. But I think if we're aligning to the content and we're providing support so that they can participate, that's where I start.
Great, thanks, Jenna. The next question is, can you speak to the role of arts learning as a tool for inclusive and differentiated instruction in other subject areas?
Yeah, I could do a whole nother webinar on that. So I think for me, the first step, and this was obviously the purpose of this webinar, was how we apply kind of the framework of differentiated instruction to arts learning. And I think that you're hitting on the second step, right, which is how do we apply what we know about arts learning to the settings where differentiated instruction is already taking place. And I think what we do is and this is totally my opinion and my work and what kind of gets me out of bed in the morning, but I think about the parts of art that align with differentiated instruction, right? So we know that arts learning is multimodal. We know that there are ways to participate in the creation of a painting that allows for you to touch and to talk and to listen and to think and to create in all of these different ways and to collaborate with your peers. And so when I think about how we can enliven inclusive settings and how we can make those arts-based settings, I think about the projects, right? So the symbolism lesson, for example, aligns with ELA content goals. I do a version of that lesson where I talk about it as an arts integrated lesson, where there are goals related to the creation of the community quote, but also where there are goals related to the identification of symbols in literature or of generating symbols as a tool to communicate meaning in text. You could use it for music as well. And in that lesson, we're using the arts activity kind of as a a tool through which we're differentiating instruction. So we're thinking about ways that every student can participate in the creation of that product, and through the creation of that product, they're making connections and they're understanding that ELA content.
Thanks, Jenna. The next question is, regarding the alarming statistics you've shared about teachers' perceived readiness to work successfully with students with disability, what work do you think needs to be done to increase inclusive education training at the college/teacher prep level?
Yeah, I think that's critical. I think it's probably the most important place that we could devote attention relative to increasing skills. I would plug two incredible programs that are in our network. The Boston Conservatory at Berkeley and Moore College of Art and Design, both of which offer two of the only Masters in Education programs in the country that are arts-based. They're for arts educators and music educators that focus on serving special populations. I think that it should be in much the same way that it is now standard practice that a general education teacher has to take at least one course in special education in their pre-service instruction programs. I think it's possibly even more critical for our arts educators, because we know, right, that historically that's the place where kids are starting their inclusion. And so I think to throw an art teacher into that setting, relying on their intuition and the kind of perceived or assumed benefits of their subject area, to do that without structured guidance about how best to reach and engage students is, I think, doing students a really big disservice. So I would start there, and as I said, I'd look to the shining examples in the field who are doing this work in educating pre-service teachers. I also think it's important that teachers have continued opportunity for professional development in this area throughout their career, and this is where I'd be remiss not to plug the webinar series or the resources that VSA puts out, the great work that our affiliates and our contractors do, and the opportunities presented by our annual conferences to come together and to share best practices. Because I think that the research shows us that when teachers don't have supports, they feel burnt out, they leave the profession. And I think that the more opportunity we can provide teachers to learn these skills and to better support their students, teachers' practices improve, teachers are more satisfied in the work that they do, and the most important thing, our students are better served.
All right, next question is going back to the opening question about why there's more inclusion in the art classroom. One of the reasons why children with disability have been successfully included in arts instruction is the 40 years of advocacy and support for that inclusion provided by VSA and its affiliates. When this SORC started, the children with disability were not typically included.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. And the people who are in this community are absolutely the driving force between making sure that this legislation was passed, that that this work continues, and that we can, and I think for us that the sort of next step now is making sure that whatever assumptions people have about the arts classroom, whatever assumptions people have or misconceptions people have about the rigor of the work that's done in the arts, that we push on that as a community, and that we make sure that yes, every kid has a right to be in this classroom. Every kid has a right to participate in the arts, to enjoy the arts, to learn in the arts, and to find meaning and a place to express themselves. But the arts matter because of their rigor as well, right? The arts, they're important in their own right, and so making sure that it's not just every kid gets to be at the table or in the room, but every kid really has access to the same high quality art and the same high quality arts instruction.
Great. Next is, can you speak more on formative assessments? What are some of the most effective formative assessments that you have seen in the art room?
Yeah. This sounds really silly, but to me, the most effective formative assessment is actually walking around and observing your students and talking to your students. It sounds really silly. It sounds not formal. I'm sure I have colleagues in research and evaluation who are somewhere aware that I'm sharing that as an assessment strategy and are like, where's the data? Why isn't it written down? But honestly, I think one of the reasons that flexible grouping is such a important part of differentiated instruction, that shaking up how kids are grouped, who they're working with, what they're working on, is because it gives you that flexibility as an educator to walk around the room, right? To look at a child who's painting their symbol and say to them, why did you choose that color? Why are you choosing to do your lines in that soft or dotted way? What does it mean when it's a heavier stroke or a heavier brush? I think all of these opportunities to see how your students respond with different peers, with different content, what their interests are, that all becomes this kind of arsenal of material that you use to inform the decisions that you make in your classroom. I go back, there's a really incredible statistic, I can't remember who did it, but the number of decisions that a teacher makes in a minute is second only to something like air traffic controllers, right? We're constantly wired to change the strategies that we use to reach our kids. And so to me, yes, we rely on formative assessments like checking understanding of vocab, the quick thumbs up, thumbs down, did you understand what the assignment was? Do you understand, this quick checks for understanding and comprehension. But I think that you get the most information by watching your kids and by giving them opportunities to share with you what they're thinking and why.
Okay, what resources do you use to find ideas of differentiation or assistive technology?
Also a great question. I think Carol Tomlinson's work is incredible. There's a citation of hers that was used in this, and the slides will go out, and I'd encourage you to research more into her. But honestly, you can type her name into Google, and you'll get like 1,000 resources that she's published. There are some really excellent rubrics for differentiation that she or folks that she's worked with or taught have used. They vary in kind of, I've seen some that I love that I wanted to use in the classroom like immediately. I've seen some that I've sort of played and tweaked with. But I think there are some really great checklists that she provides that are, what does differentiation look like? And so there are things that if you have another teacher that you work with, if you have an opportunity to, it sounds silly, but to videotape yourself and sort of observe kind of through the eyes of a student what you're doing, or even if it's just kind of reflecting on a lesson that you did, that really talk through, did I provide opportunities for flexible grouping? Did I provide students an opportunity to share with me what interested them about the lesson? Did I provide multiple ways of presenting this information? I think those resources are really, really helpful because they allow you, when you have an arts activity that you feel great about or an arts integrated activity that you really like, it allows you to challenge the assumption that it is differentiated in its own right because it's art. And so it sort of holds you accountable to, am I doing these things that I know are supported best practices for reaching a student with a disability?
It looks like that question wraps up our question.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for the great questions and insights and for allowing me the opportunity to pull some double duty today. That does conclude today's webinar. So I would like to ask you as our webinar participants to please remain on the webinar for a few moments and complete a short evaluation survey, and that'll open when you close the window. Your feedback is always appreciated. So thank you for joining us. For questions or comments, if you're thinking of any additional questions about differentiation or resources that are around, my email is on the screen. It's jgabriel@kennedy-center.org, or you can reach me by phone at 202-416-8861. Have a great day.